Welcome to the Transforming Assessment series for May. Today's session is on developing 4D farms to improve student learning and safety. So they're 4D or 3D with lots of links, environments. The presenter today is Stuart Barber from the University of Melbourne. So Stuart, would you like to begin, please?
Thanks very much, Matthew. It's great to be here to share our program with everyone, and great to see a real diversity of people from around the country. So our program, as you can hopefully see on the screen there now, is funded by the Office of Learning and Teaching. We have a lot of collaborators from both Australia and New Zealand. So Murdoch University, Massey over in New Zealand, Sydney, University of Queensland, and ourselves at the University of Melbourne. Its program has been running for the last 18 months, and I guess came about because we didn't have access to a really good tool for helping students to understand how livestock pasture and crop systems worked. So that encouraged us to develop this tool, which I'll show you for the next little while, and hopefully have some good questions on. So I know some of you probably do work in the agricultural sector, and I guess one of the problems we have teaching both agricultural and veterinary science students is we really want to take them out to properties, but one of the problems we have on properties, as you can see on the screen there, the photo on the left and the right are actually photos taken around about 10 minutes apart. So we're at the Dookie Dairy, which is a dairy farm in northern Victoria. On the left, it was about 30 degrees. And 10 minutes later it was about 10 degrees, and we had about 3 centimetres of rain in about 15 minutes. And the learning outcomes from that 3-hour practical exercise weren't that great. So in that kind of situation where it's really hot or windy or rainy, it can really impact learning, and it's hard to give a similar experience, I guess, in an environment like that. And also we want students to be able to demonstrate via assessment they can describe, compare and explain management systems on different enterprises over time. So again, having I guess a virtual farm access where students can see the same thing each time gives them a chance to reflect and revise material they've seen on farm. It also means that where we have large groups and some students may or may not have heard things that have been done, or when we visit different places at different times, it gives them the access to actually go back and revise what they should have learnt during those exercises. So that was the reason behind developing what we've developed. So our, I guess, gold standard, what we've done in the past is regular field trips out to rural properties, and we certainly don't want to get rid of that. We certainly want to maintain that to make sure students actually see what happens in the real world. I guess the problems we have with that, though, is that it's very expensive. So I routinely take 120 or 130 veterinary students up to northeastern Victoria for a 3-day trip. So it takes a lot of organising, and again, it can be again difficult with weather. 40 students per group, so trying to break those into smaller groups with more staff to make it a better learning outcome as well. And also often we'll spend quite a lot of time in the bus to try and get to rural properties. So again, we try and reduce that by having 2 or 3 days away where we stay in rural areas. But again, there's added costs with that as well. So that, I guess, has been the problem. And so we identified we wanted to try and produce a new tool. It needed to be really easy to use, so it wasn't a real barrier to use for new staff trying to use it. It needed to be viewable in a number of different environments, so we didn't want a problem where people with Macs couldn't see it or people on PCs couldn't see it. We also wanted to be able to be seen on mobile devices as well as laptops or desktop computers. Ideally editable over time. And yes, the hashtag 4D Farms is a great hashtag. I think we go with that, looking at the chat there. We wanted to be able to see change through time, and that was particularly important for us in that we struggle to show students, or struggle to illustrate to students effectively how things change through time on rural systems, so from spring to summer to autumn to winter. we also want to be able to insert a whole range of different multimedia, whether it be video or PowerPoint slides, using Excel charts for understanding various questions, and want to be able to access that from multiple points in an ideal fashion. The background to this project came out of another ALTC funded program in chemical engineering, where they developed a 4D virtual reality chemical engineering plant. And so that's, I guess, where we looked at the background to the actual IT background to this program. I guess more broadly speaking, why did we need to do this? If we go back 20 years, the majority of students coming into our courses did come from a rural background, whereas now that's very different. The majority of veterinary students, and also a lot of ag students here, come from a city background or even an international background, so they have very little experience in the rural background. And so we wanted them to be able to have continual, repeatable virtual access to properties, both before they visit, but also when they come back, so they can reflect and understand what's going on in properties. It means they can revise things with access to good English language translation if they're an English as a second language student, or if they don't understand some of our Australian terms, equally they can have a look at those at a glossary online to then actually revise that and make sure they understand what's happening. Hopefully what that does is it increases the value of their on-farm experience, so they get more out of that and they get more learning from that, and they can reflect on that when they come back as well. And it reduces some of those problems we have with group sizes. But again, we still want to take those students out onto farms to ensure they get that practical experience. So how we developed it, we spread the workload for this across the 5 universities involved in the program, which is listed at the base of the screen there. And then the other veterinary schools around Australasia are also reviewing this program for us as well. So all the veterinary schools are involved in some way in this. And I guess the development of this came primarily as a veterinary model, but also working on the assumption that this would be quite heavily utilised potentially in the agriculture sector as well as veterinary. So I think it has application in both those areas, but it was done initially with a veterinary viewpoint as a starting point. So using those different properties, using those different universities, we could get access to properties in each state, and then develop tools around that we can reuse throughout this program. And again, I guess make sure that this program gets used across all those schools and others around Australia. So where we, I guess the starting point of the project, we agreed on some intended learning outcomes at the start of the program, so we could work out from that where we needed to take images on farm. I'll just click through to those. We probably don't need to go through these learning outcomes individually, but I guess making the point that these learning outcomes influence what we did on farm, rather than taking all of our images on farm and then trying to go back to sorting out how that fitted into our learning outcomes and our assessment at the end of that. We started off with the outcomes in mind that we actually wanted to achieve. So these were agreed around our group as the larger scale learning outcomes, with again a lot of other learning outcomes or smaller ones underlying that. I just noticed a comment there about other applications. I think this sort of technology has a lot of applications in ecology or mining or any sort of area where there's environmental health and safety. So again, one of the reasons for this is to try and improve environmental health and safety for students, in that farms are quite dangerous places potentially. So again, one of the packages we are developing with this is a EHS or OHS package as well. So that's a list of our learning outcomes. And I guess one of the challenges we had is that we wanted to try and get a good breadth across Australasia of different properties. So you can see the properties there from Murdoch in the west with 2 properties which were essentially livestock and cropping, so either shedding sheep or merino sheep with cropping enterprises with them. University of Queensland, a tropical beef enterprise, a total mixed ration dairy where the cattle are relatively intensively housed in a piggery. Coming down to Victoria, a Pole Dorset stud, a relatively small Dorset stud, an Angus, a stud Angus and Charolais enterprise with a small sheep enterprise with it, a typical Victorian dairy. In New South Wales, a merino and beef enterprise, and then going over to New Zealand, up in the high country, a lamb and beef cattle enterprise, and then a predominantly grass-based dairy. So we tried to get a good spread of different enterprises around the country, so we could illustrate some of the points that are hard to show for students that don't get a chance to visit those states. And it also, I guess, has the expertise in those different states and different animal enterprises. Okay, so how do we go about doing it? What we tried to do on most properties, we had around about 25 locations per farm. As you can see on the image there, the overlay, that's actually a New Zealand dairy farm, quite a long, narrow one. And so we took images at representative points around that farm to try and illustrate the different areas of that farm and then look through that over time. So we took 7 images of each one of those green dots you can see there on the screen with 3 different exposures at each point, so 21 images from each one of those points. Then we returned to each one of those points using GPS coordinates 4 times per year, and mostly trying to do that within the seasons, more or less. So that adds up to around about half of a terabyte of photos per farm, and there's 11 farms on the entire program. So while we're there, we'd always have tours there. We try and capture additional images and also video at each visit where appropriate that we could then add to those learning modules at a later date. So that's, I guess, a general overview of how it looks. The physical process. We take those 7 images you can see at the top of the screen there, and then we knit those together using software to give us that 360-degree panorama there you can see at the base of the screen. Just using conventional software. And again, each one of these images is quite a high resolution image using a standard DSLR camera with a wide view lens on it. Once we have that flattened image, we can then effectively stretch that around the globe, so we then have a full 360-degree image, and that image we can then see through time when we adjust the time slider on our final slide. So we do kind of cheat calling it 4D in that it's actually not 3 dimensions, so you're not seeing that depth, but it is in that 360 plus time. So to actually utilize that, we've developed Evan Helline, who project managed a lot of this work, developed the 4D interface, which we can look at either on Apple or PC interfaces, so there's no problems there in terms of crosstalk between those platforms. You can look at this on mobile devices. You can use any of the common search areas, so Explorer or Firefox, Chrome or Safari all work with this fine. Tablets or iPhones, whatever you want to use, it works quite happily in all of those, which is one of our first goals, in that we could use it across all platforms. The other things like we added to each screen was the addition of weather data, and that we felt that was quite an important thing for students to understand, and it was something that was quite an important learning outcome for them. We can insert video into those images wherever we like as well, photos, text, any kind of Microsoft file or general files, and also multiple choice questions as well. So there's a whole range of material that we can actually put into that 4D virtual farms site. So I guess that's the background to what we now have. And just to run through how that interface looks, what you can hopefully see in front of you now is one of our farms in, that one's the Sydney, the New South Wales farm, just south of Sydney. So what you can see there is 5 areas of yellow circles. In the middle of the screen you can see an arrow. If you click on that arrow, it takes you to the next closest point on the farm that you can see in that direction. If you want to see where you are and where you're going on the farm, you can use the yellow circle to the left, which is the farm overview map, which has these green dots. So you can make that map appear or disappear by clicking on the little world symbol you can see down to the left-hand side of the screen. Equally, if you want to move around the farm, you can use these window panes at the base of the screen, and that takes you to any one of those different nodes around the farm. If you want to look around where you currently are, you can use left or right or up and down buttons there, and also the zoom in or zoom out function as well. So you can look in 360 degrees where you are around the farm, and also jump around the farm. If you want to know which direction you're looking, you can use this virtual compass up here, which tells you which direction you're looking, so you can orient yourself around the actual farm itself. Again, down the bottom here, you can see the rainfall chart. If we click on the tab on the far right-hand side, we can equally bring up temperature there as well. So it gives the viewer the chance to see how hot it might be at various time of the year. So this dotted line here represents the time of the visit. So we can see the rainfall for the preceding period and equal with the temperature for that time of the year. A lot of our students of our international students struggle with the seasonality here compared to being in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's quite useful for them to get their heads around those sorts of issues for here versus the Northern Hemisphere. So I guess to give you a picture of how that looks, what I've just done on this slide here is shown how that can look throughout the seasons. So what you're seeing there is spring, summer, autumn and winter from the same node on the Welcome Swallow Angus and Charolais stud. So you can see some young Charolais bulls there in the spring photo on the top left. The top right, summertime in northeastern Victoria is fairly dry, as hopefully that image shows. Once we get back to autumn, that was a particularly good autumn that year, and so younger beef bulls on there at that point in time, and again the winter shot there showing how it's wetter at that point of the year. So it illustrates that point. Hopefully that illustrates that point really well of that transition through time. Equally, if you start looking at the difference of geography and topography, if we look at the top left photo, that shows West Australia at one of the farms there at, I think that's in late November, December from memory. So you can see how it's very, very dry, typical sort of Mediterranean climate with a very, very dry early summer. In Queensland, it's one of our early visits when there'd been very little rainfall until about the time of the visit. So not a whole lot of pasture there, as has been the case for quite a while. And again, fairly hilly country there. Bottom left is a Victorian dairy property, which is on an old floodplain effectively, so very flat. And then a New Zealand property on the bottom right there, where much more challenging in terms of working that environment with the topography of that land. So again, giving that illustration and being able to compare and contrast those images. Just a question there. I did say it was a particularly good autumn on that last slide, which it was, and I guess what we have is we have 12 months of images from each farm, so it's always hard to find a typical season. The reason we included the rainfall and temperature graphs on there was to illustrate what's normal. One of the learning modules we will build with this, we haven't got finished yet, is demonstrating an average season in terms of rainfall and temperature, so we can go back and then ask questions around that, saying, would you expect, for example, the pasture growth rate to be better in that autumn compared to average? So in an ideal situation, it'd be lovely to have 10 or 20 years of images we could go through and show those over time, but at least this gives us a reference benchmark to go back and compare what actually happened using those real images that students can scan through and see what's happening. So I think that's actually one area where we can really use this as an assessment tool that's very valid and very real, in that students can go in and see what it really looks like, and they can take their time and see that, spend as much time as they like doing it, and then we can use that as an assessment tool in a whole range of different ways. Okay, I might actually leave taking for a test drive for a minute. I'm just going to go through, so we'll test drive it shortly, but I'll, rather than flicking backwards and forwards, I might just run through some extra little additional things and then spend the rest of the time running through how the system actually works. So one of the fun things, I guess, and one of the areas I think will be a much larger area over time is looking at how we actually immerse ourselves in these environments. And so this farm actually does work quite nicely in Oculus Rift. So we have got a developer's kit here and run it in Oculus Rift. And it's quite an amazing thing down and having that as your only source of vision. So equally, if you don't want to spend quite as much money using Google Cardboard, should work quite effectively as well. That's something that we're certainly looking at. So that sort of thing I think has perhaps a bit more gimmicky, but also a nice way of immersing people in that environment, so they can have a more a virtual reality tour of that environment. And we can also look at whether we're looking at the ground view or other views. So we are actually experimenting with 360-degree video as well, and looking at how that might be aligned with some of the other stuff that we're doing on the 4D farm. Again, most of this actually isn't inserted. There is one spot on there where we have put in some 360 video, but we are having a look at that. So in terms of assessment from this, I think there's some really diverse, authentic options for assessment. So within the veterinary field, we do a lot of oral exams in final year that can be quite stressful for students, and often it can be challenging to actually get them to explain what they know. In this sort of scenario, where they've seen these 4D farms over the 4-year duration or 5-year duration of their course, we can utilise scenarios they've seen before, but we can ask different questions based around different data sets with that. So hopefully it makes it less nerve-wracking for the students, and we can find out what they know, and again plan a whole range of different scenarios, whether we ask questions around if weather changed in this way or that way, what would they expect to happen based on what they can actually see on the screen. So there's a range of different things we can do there. Again, equally within case study groups, using a whole range of whether it be gameplay or scenario building, that we can use those 4D farms from whichever part of the country to run those sort of scenarios. Again, that sort of, we haven't really gone down too far around developing that assessment yet, but again, it's really a matter of I think what we want to assess and how we go about doing that, because it gives us a lot of options in terms of the material that's actually there. So we had some really good feedback from staff and reviewers, and we are using this with students this year. So it's being used at the University of Melbourne now, and also a little bit at Queensland. So it will be available. It's still, I guess, pardon me, an experimental stage at this point. We haven't quite finished building everything. It will be available come August of this year. It is very easy to use. I guess our test subjects have been my kids and some other kids or children on the families where we've done some of these farms. Most of the 5 to 10-year-olds can use it better than we can, so we think it's hopefully quite applicable to that generation and how they use it. They can probably use it a lot better than we can, to be honest. We think it's a really unique and useful way for students to gain confidence in particular, and also their understanding prior to, during their visits, and also after property visits. So for any students to actually go on to these properties, they can use their iPhone, for example, as an actual viewer on farm. With the if you enable the gyroscope function, you can actually, as you move around, the view moves with you. So if you have some sort of a viewer with a gyroscope function, you can use it in that way, which is fun. We think there's a huge range of diverse, exciting and fun applications with some great learning and assessment benefits, which I'll run through now. I'm going to see if I can make the technology work and hopefully share what it looks like. Fingers crossed. Okay, hopefully.
Yeah, I can see. We've got the homepage for 4D Farms. That looks all right. Or your local host of 4D Farms. That's
the one. So hopefully everyone can see. Again, it's that same photo you saw earlier of the bulls in that paddock. So what we actually might do, we'll start over in Western Australia. So we'll visit this farm here. Now the screen will just jump through, but I'll just click through here so you can see where we are. So what you'll hopefully, whoops, get rid of whatever that is, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Just hopefully what you can now see or soon see on your screens is a nice green grassy field. This is a farm in West Australia, down about 2 hours southeast of Perth roughly. And so what you can see on that screen there, up the top left, we have all the dates that we visited that farm. So we visited there in September, December, May, and then August. So again, if I just spin around a little bit, what I've put up there now, again, there's probably a little bit of time lag here. What I've put up there now is the farm map. And I'm just going to move to a canola crop on this property at the same time. So still stay in the same date, but I'm going to move to 2 little dots along. So we've moved from a pasture paddock to a canola crop there. Now I'll just give that a few seconds to hopefully load up at everyone's end so you can see that. And one of the hardest things we've found to try and get students to understand is that time course of what happens at various times of the year. So hopefully the change, particularly in this kind of environment, from September through to December is fairly, gives a really good illustration of how things look. So that's been, I guess, a really useful outcome for us, and students seem to understand that and enjoy looking at that. So again, we can use the property map to look around. I can click up the windows at the bottom there to look at all the different nodes around the property. Equally, the thing I haven't shown you yet is the rainfall and temperature chart. So at each time we visit, it shows the dotted line is the time of the visit. So you can see there's been very little rainfall there since October, which is fairly normal for that part of the world. And if I move through to the next visit in May, you should hopefully note on your screen that dotted line moves along to illustrate when that image was taken. So you can see prior to us arriving there in May, there'd been good rainfall in late April and early May. Hence we can see a lot of restrike of canola and grass in that cropping area. And this being a cropping and livestock property, again on this you can see the transfer from canola to wheat and then back to the pasture phase. If you go around that entire property, you can see that transition happening on different parts of the property in that year. So that's an illustration over in Western Australia. Oops. If we jump into a little bit closer to home, so if we go to Victoria, similar sort, again the same sorts of features are here. So in this farm we have a few more nodes. It's a much smaller farm than the ones in West Australia, but there's quite a lot happening on this in that it's a relatively complicated operation with stud and commercial cattle and also some sheep there as well. So we can jump around the property to different sites again and see what happens over time. So there might be summer crops happening on this property, there might be silage making, all that sort of stuff happening on this property. The same sorts of features again appear on each property, whether it be rainfall or temperature, and students again can look at the overall rainfall. So again on one of those learning outcomes is looking at pasture growth, so we have the average rainfall for the property and that sort of stuff on each area as well. So again, slightly different property. It's not as flat as the other ones over in West Australia. And again, different sorts of enterprise with cattle being there. One of the ones that tends to get the most attention from students is this one over in West Australia, in New Zealand, sorry. So to orient yourself, if you know the North Island of New Zealand, that mountain you can see in the background is Ruapehu in the North Island. But this property is a much more challenging property to get around. As you can see in our farm map, I think there's only, there's 12 nodes. Let's check. So there's 14 nodes on this property. One of the reasons for that, it is rather challenging taking some of these shots. So if you look, for example, at this shot here, there's not a whole lot of ground to actually stand on top of these peaks to take our photos. You need to be careful when you're spinning around with your 7 photos that you don't fall over a fairly large cliff. But again, it illustrates that difference, I guess, between different properties, different sizes, different stocking rates, all those sorts of areas that we find that students have problems with. Now, so that's the main things I want to show in terms of the tools around that. We'll just, okay, that wasn't what I wanted, sorry. Oops. Just got to try and re-find
Stuart, it says the application sharing has stopped, so you might have to just put it back to the slide, and then if you want to press the double squares again to start the...
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
Okay. Rightio. Sorry about that, folks. Oops, I'll get the right thing in a second. Okay, so hopefully what you can see now is one of our tools that we're creating. This is a glossary that works on the property. So what we have, so rather than being a written glossary, we used to hand out a written glossary of lots and lots of pages to students, and so it would have, you know, various terms. Again, this glossary is still very much in draft format, so don't take too much notice of the actual definitions on each thing. But in this glossary we can insert video. I'm not sure how well this will work. Sharing. Let's turn that volume up a second so you can still hear. But you can see there, this is actually one of those properties in West Australia. You can look at, so we actually had a GoPro on different parts of the combine and the tractor to show the various images. But rather than just getting a written description of how that works, we can actually look at both a written and a video description of that. If we want to see that on farm, what we do is to click our on farm button. I'll just give it a second to load up so you're making so everyone's seeing the same thing as me. And we then click on this hotspot or this flashing widget. It's done it again. Okay, rightio, that flashing widget. And what then comes up on the screen is that definition. So we can use that, whether it be, again, it can be any kind of file type we put in there, but particularly video file types the students seem to appreciate that. So this is still in development, but that background IT to be able to do that, I think really helps. Well, we hope it'll really help the student learning and our ability to assess that once we get to that point. So that's, I guess, the infrastructure behind that. We can use that in a whole lot of different learning outcomes and assessment tools as well. So if we want to create those hotspots, what we've done to develop those, as you've seen there, which hopefully you can now see an editing tool. So for example, in this tool here, we can add a new hotspot. And if I want to call that frost, click on add a hotspot. We say where we want that to be. And then we add a word to that saying frost, and then we can say appears on cold mornings for want of a better thing to say about it. And then if we go back to our actual, we go back to our editor, which I've just got out of, can't find that at the moment. I have to go back to that in a second. But if we go then back to our database, we can actually bear with me for 1 second while I just go back. Once we go back to our database, hopefully we'll then find a little note that says frost and its definition, which in this case appears on cold mornings, which I will change later. And if we then click on Show on Farm, that then takes us back to that hotspot where we can click on to that frost. So students can access this in 2 ways. They can either access that definition from the database that you've seen, or if they are going around the properties and they see some of those flashing widgets, they can click on those, and that then explains what's going on in that particular area. So there's multiple ways they can actually access that data. The other thing we can also do on this, if we have a particular zoom level or a particular time and place on a property, we have another editing tool that we can click on that and then insert that into our LMS or anywhere else. So when a student clicks on that web link, it takes them to the exact place in time at the particular view on that property, so that we can then ask questions about that particular view. So it gives us a lot of functionality as to how we can actually use that data. So I guess that's the main parts of the program and how that looks. So one question there I've just seen on the sheet is there snow in the New Zealand farm winter shots? On those hills there wasn't. We did have to delay for about 3 days going up there, in that it wasn't safe to go up to the top of those hills. It was quite wet following their drought up there. So that, I guess, is one of the challenges of going around getting these shots. But certainly it was fairly fresh. It wasn't me there then, it was Evan. But no snow on the caps. They do occasionally get it, but not regularly. Over there. So that, I guess, gives you a look of how the whole situation looks. And I'll just hopefully try and scoot back to our images again. So I think there's a whole lot of applications where we can use this in veterinary and agricultural teaching. The actual, I guess, background to it, I think, has wider application. And we still have to do a lot of work on developing the actual assessment resources that go with it. The actual technology, most of the actual imaging is, although it does, again, Evan, who worked with us on this, has a lot of expertise in 3D or 360 imaging and other work, so I was able to put a lot of this together. So it was putting a number of different platforms together into one spot that we could use. So most of it is, the vast bulk of it is freeware or relatively inexpensive if you have the right know-how, which I guess is the tricky part. So in terms of what the 4D is, this question there, so it's cheating a little bit. It's 360 degrees through time. So it's technically not 4D, so it's not, you can't see it in 3 dimensions in terms of a 3D view, but yeah, that's what we're looking at. So I should say thank you to the OLT for the funding for it. I really do want to thank all the other co-authors on this presentation as well, who put in a lot of work in each state. Also the property owners and managers who've helped us on the properties and been willing to put their properties up, as well as colleagues within each university for suggestions on improvements. So again, we've workshopped this with colleagues in each university to try and get improvements in our learning outcomes and how the site looks. And again, there's a fair bit more development there still to go with the final assessment tools that we're currently building, and the learning and teaching tools as well. And also our program reviewers, Chi Bike and Colin Wilkes as well. Okay, any questions from people? I'll just check and see you have particular burning questions that I can hopefully answer. So again, the actual technology platform, it's stuff that's out there at the moment. It's a matter of so having the expertise to put all that put all that together. One of the biggest part of this is the physical getting around and actually taking the images. So there's only a single place to do it. It's relatively easy in terms of time, but obviously this project had a lot of travel and collection of images that would be useful for the longer term. So this will be available later in the year for use. Again, the primary use we see will be in agriculture and veterinary science, but happy to chat with people if people have further questions.
Thanks, Stuart. Yep, can I just butt in here? If people could please fill in the feedback survey. The link is live on the screen. This one's actually a live link, so that'll be great. I assume, Stuart, if people have further questions, they can get in contact with you.
Yes, they can certainly contact me via email. That'd be great. And we'd love to see your feedback as to what you think of the project, and that we're keen to give feedback back to the OLT. The program will be available via the website later in the year. Whether that will stay on there long term, in that I guess our goal is that each university that wants to use it, we can certainly copy the data onto a hard drive for sending out that way. But certainly in the short term, that will be available on the website when it's released to try and support that transition process.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Actually, I had an idea. Maybe you'd like to stick them onto bootable USB drives. Then you can send it to people who don't have internet connections.
And so that's certainly those that are on universities. So so for each one of our farmers, we have it on bootable USB drives. It becomes slightly more problematic if we put the entire thing on, because you're talking about a terabyte. So it needs to be an external hard drive rather than a small USB. But yes, that's quite doable.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was thinking about this. The technology platform itself would be wonderful for doing all sorts of different things. Because actually, UQ has got a 4D construction project on as well. Yep. That they took a whole lot of images of a new engineering building they were constructing here. So this kind of technology platform would certainly help to put those images into something that's useful in an educational sense.
And I think University of Queensland was involved with the University of Melbourne in that chemical engineering plant. I think, maybe not sure on that, but I think they may have been involved in the early work as well. So yeah,
right. Okay.
I guess we've done a few more things since then with over and above what was on that original platform.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. If people don't have any further questions, feel free to stick around and ask questions. You're quite welcome to, but otherwise we'll be back. I think our next session is tentatively in June, if not August. We won't be July. It's probably going to be in July. We won't have a June session this time. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see everybody in the next session, which will be advertised through the normal channels. So thanks.
Thanks, everyone.